Roman soldiers gambling at the foot of a cross. 4 hardened men, dividing a dying man's clothes. But when they reached one specific garment, they stopped. They looked at each other. And instead of tearing it apart like everything else, they rolled dice for it. One seamless piece. So valuable, so perfectly made, that 4 Roman soldiers, men who had seen everything, men who had crucified hundreds, refused to destroy it. What was that garment? Where did it come from? And what does it tell us about the man who wore it, not just in the final hours of his life, but every single ordinary day, walking the dusty limestone roads of Galilee, teaching by the lakeshore, working wood and stone in a small village that most people had never heard of? Today, we are going back, not to the stained glass image, not to the soft Hollywood robe, not to the Renaissance painting with the luminous white and the gentle blue. We are going back to the real, historical, archaeologically verified clothing of a first-century Jewish craftsman from Nazareth. What Jesus wore was not random. It was not an accident of poverty or circumstance. Every thread, every fringe, every sandal strap carried meaning, spiritual, cultural, prophetic meaning that most people sitting in churches and watching documentaries have never been fully told. Stay with us until the end, because the detail we reveal about that seamless garment at the cross will completely change how you read the entire story of the crucifixion, and perhaps the entire story of Scripture. Let us go back 2,000 years to a small village called Nazareth, perched on a limestone ridge in the hills of Lower Galilee. Population, perhaps 200 to 400 people. A tight cluster of stone houses. A single synagogue. A well, a market of modest proportions. The surrounding hills are covered in scrub oak, wild grasses, and the silver-green shimmer of olive trees. In the valley below, the great trade road, the Via Maris, carries the commerce of the Roman world. But up here, life is slow, local, and demanding. The sun rises early and sets hot. The air smells of stone dust and wild herbs, thyme, hyssop, fennel, and the dry smell of limestone baking in the afternoon heat. A young man is already awake before the heat peaks. His hands are rough from years of working wood and stone, the calluses and small scars of a craftsman's life. He has walked these hills 1,000 times. He knows which paths lead to Jerusalem, which roads go north toward Capernaum, which hillsides give the best view of the Jezreel Valley at dawn. And right now, on an ordinary morning that Scripture does not record, he is getting dressed. This is not a ceremonial moment. This is not the Transfiguration or the triumphal entry. This is Tuesday morning in Nazareth, an ordinary day in an ordinary life. And what he reaches for first is the same thing every working man in Judea and Galilee reached for when the sun came up: the tunic. The tunic, called chiton in Greek, ketonet in Hebrew, was the foundational garment of the ancient Near East. Think of it as the base layer of everyday life, the garment that touched the skin, the first thing put on in the morning and the last thing taken off at night. For men, it typically fell to the knee. For women, to the ankle. It was loose, practical, designed to breathe in the Mediterranean heat and provide modest coverage without restricting movement. Most tunics were made from 2 rectangular pieces of cloth, one for the front, one for the back, stitched together at the shoulders and down the sides, with openings cut for the head and arms. Some had short sleeves sewn in, others were more like sleeveless ponchos. The construction was simple enough that tunics could be made at home, though professional weavers and garment makers also operated in larger towns and cities throughout the region. The material for a Galilean craftsman's tunic almost certainly came from wool, sheared from the local sheep and goats that grazed across the Galilean hills in their thousands. Wool was the workhorse of ancient fabric. It was warm in the cold of desert nights, surprisingly breathable in the heat when woven loosely, naturally resistant to fire and moisture, and durable enough for a life of hard physical labor. A well-made wool tunic could last for years, even decades, with proper care. Linen also existed and was widely used, woven from flax grown in the fertile valleys of the Jordan and the coastal plains, and would have been prized for its lightness and coolness in the summer months. A man like Jesus, working year-round in varying conditions, likely owned both a heavier wool tunic for the cool months and a lighter linen garment for the height of summer heat. The color would have surprised modern eyes raised on centuries of Christian iconography. We are conditioned, deeply, almost unconsciously conditioned, to see Jesus draped in brilliant white or vivid crimson. Pure white garments in the first century were rare, expensive, and reserved for specific occasions: religious festivals, temple ceremonies, the formal garments of priests and high officials. Achieving true white required extensive bleaching, repeated exposure to sunlight, and multiple washings in a society where water was precious. An ordinary working man's tunic was earthy. Browns drawn from walnut shells or oak bark, ochres and muted yellows from pomegranate rind or saffron, soft and faded reds from madder root, dull greens from certain plant compounds. The colors of the land itself, practical colors that hid the dust of the road and the grime of the carpenter's workshop, that did not show the sweat of a long day of teaching in the open air. Around the waist, Jesus would have cinched the tunic with a belt or girdle, sometimes a simple strip of leather cut from cow or goat hide, sometimes a longer woven cloth band wrapped several times around the midsection. This was not merely a fashion accessory. The belt transformed the tunic from a loose, flowing garment into a practical work tool. A man could gird his loins, pull up the hem of the tunic, and tuck it into the belt, creating a shortened garment that freed the legs for running, climbing, heavy lifting, or any work that required full range of movement. This is precisely why the phrase "gird your loins" in Scripture carries such strong connotations of readiness and action. It was a physical posture of preparation, instantly recognizable to anyone in the ancient world. Over the tunic came the outer garment, the himation in Greek, the simla or me'il in Hebrew, the mantle, the cloak, what most English translations simply call the coat or outer robe. This was a large, roughly rectangular piece of cloth, typically around 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, draped over the shoulders and wrapped around the body in various ways, depending on the weather, the occasion, and personal preference. Unlike the tunic, which was at least partially tailored and sewn, the himation was essentially a sophisticated length of fabric. The skill was entirely in how you wore it, how you folded it, draped it across the shoulders, wrapped it against the cold, or threw it back in the heat. This garment was the most versatile item a person owned, and for many of the poor in first-century Judea and Galilee, it was also the most valuable. During the day, it served as a coat, providing warmth and protection from wind and sun. When the temperature dropped in the evening, and in the Galilean hills and the Judean desert, temperatures could drop dramatically after sunset, the himation became a blanket. A man traveling the roads between towns, sleeping rough in the open air, might have no other bedding. It was so essential to basic survival that Mosaic law in Exodus explicitly prohibited keeping a poor man's cloak as overnight collateral for a debt. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering. God himself commanded Israel, because that cloak is his blanket. That cloak is his warmth. That cloak, for the poorest man in Judea, was the difference between sleeping and shivering. Jesus references this very garment directly in the Sermon on the Mount. If anyone wishes to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak also. He is describing a level of generosity so radical it sounds absurd to modern ears, and it sounded equally radical to ancient ones. Give not just the inner garment, but the outer one too, the one you use as a blanket, the most valuable thing you own. Give it. Walk away without it. His audience understood precisely what he was asking, and the shock of it was entirely intentional. As a Jewish man living in complete obedience to the Torah, Jesus would also have worn on his outer garment the tzitzit, the fringes, the tassels, attached to the four corners of his cloak. This was not a decoration. This was not a fashion choice. This was a direct command of God, recorded in Numbers 15, "Speak to the people of Israel, and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them." The tzitzit were a wearable reminder system. Every time you looked down and saw those fringes moving with your steps, reaching across a table, lifting a tool, walking a road, you were pulled back to the covenant, to the 613 commandments, to who you were as a son of Israel and who you belonged to as a servant of God. In the first century, the tzitzit were typically white wool cords with a single thread of blue, the techelet, woven into each corner fringe. The source of the techelet blue was a specific sea creature, likely the murex snail of the Mediterranean coast, whose secretion could be processed into a specific shade of blue that was mandated for the priestly garments and the tabernacle curtains. The exact process for producing this dye was later lost, perhaps deliberately suppressed during centuries of persecution. And the correct shade of techelet remained a matter of intense scholarly debate for nearly 2,000 years. Several Jewish communities today have revived the practice based on modern research into the murex snail, but in Jesus' time, every observant Jewish man wore those blue threads hanging from the corners of his outer garment, swaying with every step. For Jesus, as a man whose entire life was a perfect fulfillment of the Torah rather than an abandonment of it, who said explicitly, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them," the tzitzit were not optional. They were an expression of who he was. And they carried power. The Gospel of Matthew records that as Jesus moved through the crowds of Galilee and Judea, people pressed forward specifically to touch the fringe of his garment. The Greek word used, kraspedon, refers precisely to the tzitzit, the corner fringes. They were not reaching randomly for the hem of his robe. They were reaching for the blue threaded fringes, the visual sign of a man who walked in complete obedience to God's commands. And healing flowed from the touch of those fringes repeatedly. In Gennesaret, in the crowd, from the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and who reached through a press of bodies and touched them and was immediately healed. There is a connection here so striking that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The prophet Malachi, writing in the last book of the Hebrew Bible, more than 400 years before the birth of Jesus, had written, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings." The word translated as wings in Hebrew is kanaf, and kanaf is the same word used throughout the Torah for the corners of a garment where the tzitzit hang. Wings, corners, the same Hebrew word, healing in its wings, healing in its fringes. When those desperate people reached out in the crowd and touched the tzitzit of Jesus, they were, perhaps without consciously knowing the text they were enacting, touching the fulfillment of a 400-year-old prophecy written by Malachi. The Son of Righteousness, rising with healing in his fringes. Pause here for just a moment. Think about what we have just described, 4 centuries of prophetic waiting. And then an ordinary woman with a 12-year illness pushes through a crowd in Galilee and touches the corner fringe of a carpenter's cloak, and is healed instantly. Scripture fulfilling Scripture through the clothing of a working man. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many other details like this, ordinary details that look like background color, are woven through the gospel accounts, waiting to be seen? Keep that in mind as we keep going. Now let us come to the feet. In a land of limestone paths, rocky hillsides, Roman-built stone roads, and village tracks thick with summer dust and winter mud, footwear was not a luxury. It was a daily necessity of survival. The standard footwear of first-century Judea and Galilee was the sandal. Leather soles, typically cut from cow or camel hide, and sometimes with multiple layers laminated together for durability, held to the foot by leather straps or woven cords threaded through holes cut in the sole and tied around the foot and ankle. Sandals were practical, affordable for most families, and deeply embedded in the symbolic language of Jewish culture. To remove another man's sandals was considered an act of profound servitude, so degrading and intimate a task that John the Baptist, preaching in the wilderness and drawing enormous crowds, declared himself unworthy even to perform this act for the one coming after him. He who is coming after me is mightier than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. This was not false modesty. In the cultural world of the first century, carrying or removing sandals was the work of the lowest household slave. For John, a prophet, a son of a priest, a man the whole nation was coming out to hear, to say he was not worthy even for that task was a statement of enormous theological weight. Sandals also carried positive symbolic meaning. To give someone your sandals was to honor them, to transfer your standing to them. When the father in the parable of the prodigal son calls for sandals to be put on his returning son's feet, it is not simply a matter of comfort after a long journey, it is a public declaration of restored status. Slaves went barefoot. Sons wore sandals. The sandals announced, "This person belongs here." He is not a servant, he is a son. Jesus sent his disciples out on mission with sandals on their feet, the minimum required for travel, for dignity, for readiness on the road. He himself walked those same roads, the road from Nazareth down through Cana to Capernaum, the road from Jericho up through the Judean hills to Jerusalem, a climb of over 3,000 feet through dry, rocky terrain, the road through Samaria, the paths along the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Archaeological evidence from the region, including sandals preserved in the caves near the Dead Sea, shows exactly what first-century footwear looked like. Simple, sturdy, functional leather construction, remarkably similar across class lines, with minor variations in quality of the leather and complexity of the straps. What about the head? Popular imagination tends to place Jesus either bareheaded with flowing hair, or occasionally with a kind of soft draped cloth over the head. The historical reality is more nuanced and more interesting. Jewish men of the first century did not have a uniform daily religious requirement to cover the head in the way that later traditions, both Jewish and Christian, would develop and codify. The formal requirement for men to cover the head during prayer was still in a formative stage during the Second Temple period. However, practical head covering would have been extremely common simply due to the climate. The sun of Galilee and Judea in summer is intense, temperatures regularly exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal shade on the open roads and hillsides where Jesus spent much of his time teaching. A simple cloth drawn over the head and shoulders, a kind of early sudarium or head wrap, would have been a practical daily necessity for any man spending long hours outdoors. During formal religious observances, synagogue readings, and prayer, covering the head may well have been practiced, reflecting emerging customs around reverence before God. The phylacteries, small leather boxes containing Torah passages, strapped to the forehead and arm during morning prayers, were also part of the religious dress of observant Jewish men, though Jesus explicitly criticized those who made their phylacteries conspicuously broad to signal their piety in the marketplace. Women consistently veiled in public. This was a deeply embedded cultural expectation across the Jewish, Greek, and Roman worlds of the first century, rooted in overlapping concerns about modesty, social identity, marital status, and public decorum. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha of Bethany, Joanna, Susanna, all the women who are named in the gospel accounts as part of the circle around Jesus would have worn head coverings as a matter of daily life. The veiled woman was the norm in every social context, from the street market to the synagogue. Let us also consider deliberately what Jesus would not have worn, because the negative space is as revealing as the positive. He would not have worn the elaborate, ostentatious robes of the scribes and Pharisees that he explicitly and repeatedly criticized. In Matthew 23, he describes those who love to walk around in long robes and greet people with respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Men whose clothing was a performance of religious status, a visible advertisement of their spiritual superiority. He warned his followers against dressing to be seen. He mocked the vanity of religion as fashion in the sharpest terms. He would not have worn the purple and fine linen of the wealthy elite, the Herodian courtiers, the high priestly families whose enormous wealth came from temple commerce, the Roman administrators in their official dress. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man is specifically described as dressing in purple and fine linen every day, the colors of empire, the fabrics of luxury, while at his gate a beggar lay covered in sores. The contrast is deliberate and devastating. What Jesus wore put him squarely, visibly, unmistakably among the ordinary people. The fishermen who became his disciples, the farmers who came out to hear him from the surrounding villages, the tax collectors, the lepers who stood at the edge of town, the women who had no social standing, the children the disciples tried to turn away. He looked like them. He dressed like them. There was nothing in his appearance that marked him as separate from the crowd, which is precisely why Judas had to identify him with a kiss in the darkness of Gethsemane. You could not pick Jesus out by his clothing. He was wearing a tunic. And then came the night they arrested him. And then the morning they crucified him. And then the moment that Scripture has been building toward since the soldiers picked up the garments of a man hanging on a cross outside Jerusalem. John 19, verse 23. The crucifixion is underway. The Roman soldiers have done what Roman soldiers did after an execution. They have divided the condemned man's possessions among themselves. This was legal, established Roman custom. A man executed by Rome forfeited everything he owned. The soldiers took his outer garments and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier present at the execution. Standard, routine, unremarkable. But then they came to the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." Stop. Read that again slowly. Seamless, woven in one piece, from top to bottom. This is not how ordinary tunics were constructed. We have already described the standard technique: 2 rectangular pieces of cloth stitched together at the shoulders and along the sides. Simple, efficient. The method used by the vast majority of garment makers across the region. Making a genuinely seamless tunic required an entirely different and far more skilled technique: circular weaving, in which the cloth is constructed as a single unbroken tube on a specialized loom, shaped and sized as it is woven so that the finished garment emerges with no seams whatsoever. Not at the shoulders, not at the sides, not anywhere. This technique required significantly more time, more technical skill, more specialized equipment, and more raw material than standard tunic construction. It was not something available at the ordinary village market. It was not something a Nazareth craftsman could have simply purchased on a regular day. This was a high-quality, carefully made garment. So where did it come from? The Gospel account does not tell us directly, but the possibilities are theologically rich. Several scholars have suggested it may have been a gift, perhaps woven by one of the women who are mentioned in Luke's Gospel as following Jesus and supporting his ministry from their own resources. Luke names Joanna, the wife of Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others. These were women of some means who had chosen to fund the movement. A seamless tunic, requiring skilled weaving and significant investment of time, would have been a plausible gift from such a community. The hands that wove it may have understood, in some way they could not fully articulate, that they were making something significant. But here is where the detail of the seamless tunic becomes extraordinary, and where the Gospel of John reveals its deepest layer of meaning to those who know where to look. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, in his work Antiquities of the Jews, describes the garments of the high priest of Israel in careful detail. The high priest wore multiple layers of sacred garments when he entered the temple, and especially when he entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. the one day each year when the high priest alone could pass through the veil into the innermost sanctuary to make atonement for all Israel. Josephus writes that the high priest's inner robe, the garment worn closest to his body, was woven without seam. It was made, Josephus says, of one continuous piece of cloth, without any joining of separate pieces. A seamless garment worn by the high priest as he offered the blood of atonement for the sins of the people. The language Josephus uses to describe the high priest's seamless robe is strikingly parallel to the language John uses in his gospel to describe the tunic of Jesus at the cross. Scholars across centuries have noticed this parallel. Whether John intends the connection consciously as a theological signal, or whether it emerges organically from the deep coherence of the story as it was unfolding, the resonance is unmistakable and profound. At the cross, in the moment of the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus is wearing the garment of the high priest. The letter to the Hebrews will later make this theological argument explicit. In sustained and careful detail, Jesus is our great high priest, who has passed not through an earthly sanctuary made with human hands, but through the heavens themselves, who has offered not the blood of bulls and goats repeated year after year, but his own blood, once for all, entering the true Holy of Holies, securing an eternal redemption. But here in John's Gospel, before the theology is articulated in words, the image is already visible in the clothing. The seamless robe, the high priest, the sacrifice, woven into the fabric of the story, literally woven into the fabric of the garment, so naturally that 4 Roman soldiers nearly missed it, until they looked at that tunic and found themselves unable to tear it apart. So they cast lots. And Psalm 22, written by David 1,000 years before this moment, in a poem of anguished abandonment and ultimate trust, had already described it with uncanny precision. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. The soldiers were not making a theological statement. They were not enacting a religious ritual. They were just being practical about dividing a dead man's belongings fairly. But in their practicality they were fulfilling, to the letter, a prophecy spoken a millennium earlier. Every roll of the dice was Scripture completing itself. We are getting close to the end now, and I want to stop and ask you something directly. Has your picture of Jesus shifted during this video? Even slightly? Not just what he wore, but who he was in the everyday texture of his life. A working man in a wool tunic the color of dust, fringes swaying from the corners of his cloak, carrying a 400-year-old prophecy in their blue threads. A seamless garment that echoed the robes of the high priest, worn not in the temple but on a Roman execution ground. Does this feel more real to you than the figure in the paintings? We genuinely want to know. Tell us in the comments below, because we read every single one. Beyond the cross, clothing weaves through the entire ministry of Jesus in moments that are easy to rush past but reward slow attention. At the Last Supper, in the upper room in Jerusalem, John tells us that Jesus rose from the table, removed his outer garments, the himation, and wrapped a servant's linen towel around his waist. Then he knelt before his disciples, one by one, and washed their feet. The removal of the outer garment was itself a significant gesture. The himation was the mark of a teacher, a rabbi, the garment in which you sat and taught, the cloak of authority and identity. Jesus took it off. He set aside the visual marker of his position and took the posture of the lowest household servant in a wealthy Roman home. And then he did the work of that servant, washing feet caked with the dust of Jerusalem's streets, for the 12 men he was about to send out to change the world. Earlier in the ministry, high on a mountain, Tabor or Hermon, scholars continue to debate. Something happened to Jesus' clothing that no natural process could explain. The Transfiguration. Mark's account reaches for language and almost gives up. His clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. Matthew says his face shone like the sun and his garments became white as light itself. Luke says his clothing became gleaming white, flashing like lightning. The Greek word stilbonta means to flash, to radiate, to gleam with an inner luminosity. This is not a description of exceptionally clean laundry. This is a momentary, involuntary unveiling. The ordinary wool and linen of a Galilean craftsman becoming the vehicle for a glory that belonged to another order of reality entirely. And then, it was over. He came down the mountain. He put the ordinary clothes back on. He walked back into the crowds, back into the arguments with Pharisees, back into the hunger and the illness and the confusion of ordinary life. The king returned to the disguise. This tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary in the clothing and person of Jesus is perhaps the deepest thread running through everything we have explored today. He wore what working men wore. He looked like his neighbors. He was not immediately identifiable by his dress as someone extraordinary. Judas needed to point him out with a kiss. And yet, under those common garments, in the fringes that carried ancient prophecy and flowed with healing, in the seamless tunic that whispered of high priesthood, in the body that blazed with light on a northern mountaintop, there was a glory being deliberately and consistently concealed. Theologians call this the kenosis, from the Greek word for emptying. Paul writes in Philippians 2 that Jesus, though existing in the form of God, did not grasp at equality with God but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in human likeness. The clothing is part of that emptying. The King of the universe did not announce himself with the robes of royalty. He came in wool and leather, in rough spun linen and earthy dyes. He came looking like everyone around him, because the people he came to save were wearing those same garments. Clothing and identity are woven together throughout the whole arc of Scripture in a way that the Jesus story brings to its fullest expression. In Genesis, after the fall, God himself makes garments of skin for Adam and Eve to cover their shame, the first act of divine clothing, the first sacrifice, the first blood shed to cover human nakedness. The high priests of Israel were clothed in elaborate sacred garments that symbolized their role as mediators between God and the people. The prophets wore distinctive clothing that marked them as set apart, Elijah's mantle of power, passed to Elisha when he was taken up. Isaiah walked naked for 3 years as a prophetic sign. John the Baptist came in camel's hair and a leather belt, looking deliberately like Elijah returned. And Jesus comes in a working man's tunic, unrecognizable, hidden in plain sight. At the Transfiguration, the hidden glory breaks through for 3 disciples on a mountaintop. At the resurrection, the grave clothes are left behind, the tunic gone, the face cloth folded neatly by itself, and the body that wore them has passed into a new order of existence. The revelation of John sees the risen Christ clothed in a long robe with a golden sash, eyes like a flame of fire, his face shining like the sun in full strength. And at the final return, the rider on the white horse, called Faithful and True, he is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. And on his robe and on his thigh is written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The hiddenness is over. The ordinary wool and leather are behind him. But on the roads of Galilee, in the synagogues and on the hillsides and along the lakeshore, he wore the clothes of the people he came to serve, by deliberate, sovereign choice. Because humility was not an accident of his circumstances, it was the shape of his mission. Paul draws out the spiritual implication in Galatians 3, as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. The language of dressing, the language of clothing, as if the entire life of faith is a matter of putting on the right garment, being clothed in his righteousness rather than your own. The garment that was stripped from him at the cross, the tunic, the himation, the dignity, the life, stripped so that it could ultimately be given to the ones for whom he died. There is one final detail. After the resurrection, when Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb in the pre-dawn darkness of the first day of the week, she finds the burial cloths lying in the tomb. The linen wrappings that had covered his body are there, and the face cloth, the sudarium that had been placed over his head, was not lying with the other cloths. It had been folded, set aside separately, neatly, deliberately folded in a place by itself. John records this detail with the precision of an eyewitness, or the precision of a man who interviewed eyewitnesses and recognized that this specific detail mattered. The body of Jesus did not simply vanish, leaving disordered wrappings behind. The face cloth was folded. Someone, or something, had taken care to fold it before leaving. Whether or not the specific cultural traditions sometimes cited, that a folded napkin left at a table in first-century Jewish culture signaled a master's intention to return, is historically verifiable in the way popular accounts sometimes claim. The image itself carries weight. These are not the burial clothes of a man who is finished. These are the garments of a man who has set them aside because he no longer needs them, who has moved beyond them into something the clothes could not contain. The working man's tunic, the seamless robe, the garments stripped at the cross, the burial clothes left folded in a garden tomb. Every piece of clothing in the story of Jesus tells us something. About his humanity, about his priesthood, about his humility, about his glory, about the God who clothes the lilies of the field and yet chose to wear the wool of a Galilean craftsman in order to walk among us, teach us, die for us, and rise, leaving the grave clothes behind, never to wear them again. The soldiers gambled for his clothes at the foot of the cross, but the cross itself was Jesus giving everything, his breath, his blood, his life, his seamless garment, for the sake of the world. And the resurrection is the answer. The tomb is empty. The face cloth is folded. The man in the working man's tunic is gone from the grave. And the invitation of the gospel, the invitation woven through every page from Genesis to Revelation, is to be clothed in him, to put on Christ, to wear his righteousness the way he once wore a craftsman's wool tunic, not as a performance, not as a display, but as the most natural, everyday expression of who you are and who you belong to. If this journey into the real world of Jesus, his clothing, his culture, the daily material texture of his life, has opened something new for you today, we would genuinely love to hear about it. What struck you most? Was it the tzitzit and the 400-year-old prophecy of Malachi about healing in the wings? Was it the seamless tunic and its connection to the high priest at the cross? Was it the folded face cloth in the empty tomb? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single comment, and your responses genuinely shape what we explore next on Biblical Worlds. Please take a moment to like this video. It makes an enormous difference in helping other people find this content. Subscribe to Biblical Worlds if you have not already, and ring the notification bell so you are with us for what is coming next. We are going deep into the world of the Bible, not to make it more religious, but to make it more real. Until next time, may the God who clothed the lilies of the field, who wrapped the heavens like a garment, who wore a workman's tunic on the roads of Galilee, clothe your life with his grace, his truth, and his unshakable peace.